Hey YouTube, I've always thought it's been really cool to learn about where people come from. So I thought, why not share where I come from? I know this sounds kind of narcissistic. So this video is going to show you the perspective of somebody that comes from parents that were born from a culture overseas, but is born into westernized culture. So I'm going to go over the hardships, the cool, the bad, things of that nature. Now for context, both my parents are Filipino. They immigrated here in the 90s, specifically Canada, which I love and call home. One typical thing a lot of first generation kids feel is the in-between, which is feeling like you're in a crack and you don't know where you belong. So for example, when you hang out with your westernized friends, you feel like you're too Asian for them. And then when you hang out with the real Asians or like Filipinos, you're too whitewashed for them. And you kind of develop this identity crisis where like you just don't know where you belong. So for example, you get comments from your westernized friends like, oh, of course you know that because you're Asian, or of course you're good at math because you're Asian. So then by the time I got to university and I started hanging out with the real Filipinos who have like literally just got there that year, I could not connect with them at all. I found myself just hanging out with them just because they were Filipino. And then whenever I would talk about things, it felt like maybe I was just too whitewashed for them. And that's typically a term that gets thrown around a lot when you're a first generation Asian American. But I will say though, it's pretty much more of a bigger deal than you think it is, to be honest. One cool thing that I love is the family dynamic and being able to see both perspectives from westernized culture and Filipino culture. So for example, in westernized culture, older seniors will typically be in a what do you call those, like a nursing home, like for old people. And like the typical, when you're 18 you move out, there's a lot of like individualness that goes into, not individualness, but independency is really harped on and pushed. But I will say though, not as much, because with the state of the market, if you were to move out at 18, you're probably living in a box. And compared to Filipino culture, family is like this, where there's a good chance you're gonna find like 3 generations within a Filipino household. I mean, even if the older generations were still alive, you would probably find like 5 generations within a house. Because with our older parents, grandparents, we've always been raised and taught to take care of them. And for decades, even in the early 2000s, that's like as far as I can go, I'd say it was definitely normal to stay at home throughout your 20s. But I will say though, I feel like westernized culture is developing. We're more accepting of being able to stay home into your 20s. Because with the state of the market, there's just no way that you can own a house, which is totally understandable why a lot more kids are staying home after university or high school. But I think it's really cool to see that in Filipino culture, we're always taught to just look out for each other. And another really cool thing is being able to share Filipino food with westernized people. A lot of my white friends just love Filipino food, especially lumpia, pancit. You are just hyped up. Once they find out you're Filipino, they're gonna ask you probably about food. And every white person I know just loves Filipino food and just wants more of it. I mean, low-key, my mom used to sell lumpia to like my teachers at school. And I think the advantage that I have was that at home, I always had access to Filipino food. And if I ever got sick of it, you know, I could just make westernized food at home, cook burgers, steak, fries, or just go out and get it. And what's really cool is that where I'm located, there's a lot of Filipino food, and just being able to know the good places is just such an underrated thing, to be honest. Another big difference between westernized culture and Filipino culture is that in westernized culture, they tend to look out for themselves between strangers. Like when you're on the street, you're not always gonna find people that are gonna help out.
Why are you running?
I mean, which is kind of understandable, to be honest, because they don't know you, right? But in Filipino culture, everybody just helps each other out. Everyone is just out there to look out for each other. And that's just the way that they've always been raised. I've tend to notice that behavior being here in westernized culture and seeing all the Filipinos here. They always really look out for each other, whether it's a stranger or Filipino. And what I think is really cool is that it actually spills down onto the first generation kids. You're generally taught to just like watch out for each other. And it's kind of cool to just see that we understand that between each other, just because we understand like some of the same hardships that we go through and maybe what our families go through as well. Another cool thing that I think is actually kind of funny is learning the superstitions in Filipino culture and telling my friends about it, because they think it's just absurd.
Is this serious?
Doesn't make sense at all. So for example, like going to sleep with your hair wet, you're gonna go crazy or something. And I remember hearing that like if you go to a funeral, you can't go home right away or else the ghost is gonna follow you or something like that. There are way more superstitions in Filipino culture. If you have any, let me know down below. But yeah, I love learning about those and I love telling my white friends about them. It's like, how do you guys even come up with this? One weird thing too, I don't know if it's in every city, but in my city specifically, there are a lot of Filipino kids that can understand the language but just can't speak it. I've heard it so many times. I don't know if it's just where I live, but I've heard that a lot. Let me know if that happens in your city as well. Now, there are poor people here in the West, and there are also poor people in the Philippines. Now, I'm not gonna argue who is more off, but I will say I have seen beggars here on the street that got $5, $10, $20 cash. If they were in the Philippines, they pretty much went up a class. I'm joking. But still, being able to see the difference, I've learned to appreciate what I have, because knowing poor, like real poor, especially in the Philippines, is crazy. And I know there are a lot of government programs here that help out the homelessness here that don't exist back home in the Philippines. So I will say there is kind of a difference, but being able to see the difference in a different kind of poor in another country really opens my eyes to see what I have to appreciate. Now, all in all, if you're like me and, you know, maybe you feel like you're in a crack, realize that you actually have an advantage, because you don't just have one perspective, but you actually have two perspectives in context of Westernized culture and Filipino culture, or wherever culture that you have. And having multiple perspectives gives you an open mind where you can learn more things. You get to experience two different cultures or more wherever you come from. But if you guys enjoyed this one, please like it, and I'll see you guys in the next one. And watch this video or any of other my videos. Okay, peace.
Yeah, no way, talk down and we finish, babe. Count up, yeah, we getting to the cake. Speed up, never got my foot on brake. Boss up, on my mama, this my fate.